You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
Incoming transmission.
Hello, this is Matt and McKinley from History Dispatches.
We are the father-son duo bringing you the weird, the wild, the wacky, and the craziest tales from across time.
From the Ice Bowl
to the Great Heathen Army.
And the head of Oliver Cromwell.
The same head they kept on a pike for 3 years?
Yep, all here on History Dispatches.
New episodes every weekday.
Find out more at historydispatches.com or wherever you get your podcast app.
As a longtime foreign correspondent, I've worked in lots of places, but nowhere as important to the world as China. I'm Jane Perlez, former Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times. On Face Off, the US versus China, we'll explore what's critical to this important global relationship. Trump and Xi Jinping, AI, TikTok, and even Hollywood. New episodes of Face Off are available now, wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 210, The Battle Before Britain, Part 2, Flying Blind. This week, a big thank you goes out to Cybram, Autumn, and Tom for choosing to support the podcast by becoming members. You can find out more about becoming a member and other ways to support the podcast over at historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members. The Second World War would be a technology accelerator, with tremendous amounts of money poured into a variety of technological innovations with the purpose of winning the war. The innovations from the war years would have eventually happened either way, but the requirements of the war brought them into the world and into operational use much sooner. But as we look back from the modern day, how we interpret and understand the war is impacted by technologies that we have easy access to that did not exist in 1940. There are some obvious examples of this: the internet, smartphones, modern medicine, podcasting, of course. But the one we're going to discuss today is something you may not think about very often. If you are listening to this, it is very likely that within arm's reach, you have a device that will tell you at any moment precisely where you are located on Earth to within a few meters of accuracy. This is just one of those facts that many people never even really think about, but it's really pretty amazing, particularly in comparison to how difficult or impossible it would have been to get that information just 80 years ago. Now, in a lot of ways, this was not always important, because in warfare during the Second World War, knowing one's exact position was only marginally valuable, and relative position was often more important. It doesn't really matter exactly where I am, just that there's a tank 100 meters that way, and that kind of stuff. But one area where knowing your exact location was important was around strategic bombing. The goal of strategic bombing was, even in an area bombing campaign, to hit a specific target. That target could be as small as a factory or a bridge, it could be as large as a city, but there was always a target. Finding that target could be complicated by any number of factors, but the most impactful was always darkness. Bombing a target at night was a major challenge before the Second World War, but if an air force could master it, then there were certain key benefits that they could take advantage of. A lack of visibility for the defenders made it more likely that the bombers would arrive over the target without being detected. Even if they were detected, aerial interception was very difficult, bordering on impossible, and the defenders were less likely to be ready to act against a nighttime bombing raid. All of these benefits would slowly be eroded throughout the course of the war, primarily with the proliferation of radar, both on the ground and eventually in the air. But especially at the beginning of the war, there were real advantages to bombing targets at night. But to effectively bomb targets at night, you had to find the target. And without the aid of modern GPS, entire systems and technologies had to be developed to help bombers know where they were going and when they needed to release their payloads. In the skies over Britain in 1940, this would take the form of radio navigational aids that were used by the Germans to give their bombers the ability to follow certain signals along a line to the target. And then another signal would sort of intersect with that line to tell the bombers when they were over the target and when they should release their bombs. The first systems were based on off-the-shelf commercial radio navigation systems that had been in use before the war. But after these were counteracted by the British, further systems would be developed that used different frequencies to achieve the same results. The problem for the Germans was that the radio waves could not be hidden, but it would take the British months, and they had to get lucky with some downed German aircraft to find the equipment and the frequencies that were being used. But eventually they were able to counteract what the Germans were doing, specifically because, again, you can't hide radio waves. This episode is going to cover the development of those German systems, and then how the British found out about them and developed ways to impact their effectiveness. It's an interesting way to discuss the kind of technological back and forth that would occur in so many different areas of the war. Just in this case, we're talking about radio waves above Britain during the last 6 months of 1940. Oftentimes, one of the best ways that militaries during the interwar years and during the Second World War could understand a system used by the enemy was to develop their own similar system that helped to explore what was possible and give some insight into how an enemy system might also work. This was done for technologies like radar, with many different nations developing their own, and that resulted in there being teams in each nation that really understood the problem space and the general parameters of how systems might be built. When it came to navigational aids for bombers, while the Germans were working on radio navigational aids, the British were not really putting an official RAF effort into developing this technology and the skills to use it. Instead, they believed two competing and, in retrospect, incompatible facts. The first was that the Germans would not be able to bomb at night. They would instead be forced into strictly daylight operations, and operations in good weather, which would limit their ability to launch a campaign over Britain and would make them very vulnerable to the efforts of fighter command. The second fact that they believed was that the plucky pilots and navigators of RAF Bomber Command would not have any problem finding their targets at night through such novel technologies as celestial navigation and dead reckoning. I think this is a pretty good example of a very common British viewpoint before the Second World War, which was, I guess, something you could call British exceptionalism. It was the idea that the British were just better than everybody else, and they would find a way to do things successfully where other nations couldn't. In some instances, this was influenced by a racism that was kind of added into the mix, which came into play with completely incorrect evaluations of the Japanese, for example, which is of course a story for another day. But even with the Germans, there were at times a complete underestimation of what Germany as a collective entity was capable of. Before we talk about the downsides of these views, it's worth pointing out that there were also benefits to this kind of confidence, particularly at the highest levels of national leadership, when faced with a national challenge like having an enemy preparing to invade. But there were also downsides, like with radio navigation. Working from the assumption that it was impossible for the Germans to launch a nighttime bombing campaign, the RAF leadership downplayed the need for nighttime defense. This would be most impactful in the areas of aerial interception, where the British were, for lack of a better term, in a hopeless situation for most of 1940. If they had seen night bombing as a serious threat, maybe things would have been different and more effective countermeasures would have been designed before German bombers were dropping bombs on British cities. On the other side of this whole conversation were the Germans, and they recognized quite early on that it would be impossible for their bombers to find targets without some help. This belief was formed after the German bombing experiences during the Spanish Civil War. During that conflict, the German bombers had found it almost impossible to find targets at night, and this had had a disastrous effect on the accuracy of their bombing. The result of these experiences was an effort made into creating a radio navigation system, which was really just an expansion of what many nations already used on their airfields, both military and civilian. These were used to help aircraft find their original airfields and to land on them during peacetime. And during that time, a radio signal would be broadcast which an aircraft could hone in on and then land. The Germans used something similar during the war, because while it was hard to find targets to bomb, it was equally difficult to find out where your home base was after a combat sortie. This system would be extended through the use of radio beacons and towers set up throughout the newly occupied French territories. On a technical level, the system was built around a series of radio beams that were broadcast in a line across Britain, intersecting with the target. But it is interesting how this was used by the pilots flying the bombers. And for that, we're actually going to turn to a description from a German airman that bailed out over Britain during the fighting in 1940. He would describe the system, not to the British, but to another prisoner, like this. Quote, "It cuts every human weakness, every human error, because it's purely mechanical. When I'm on this beam and I have tuned this apparatus in, then I hear da, 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 da. And when I hear that, then I know for certain that I'm on the left of the beam. So then I would steer to the right. And then if I hear dit, 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 then I know I'm on the right-hand side of the beam. If I hear a continuous note, then I know for certain that I'm on the navigation beam. That is the wonderful part of it. I need not do anything except fly my aircraft quite mechanically along the continuous note. I really like that quote from the German pilot because it talks about not just what was happening, but also why it was happening. It helped to remove the possibility of human error. Because when the plane arrived at the target, it would encounter another radio note, which would begin the drop sequence. One radio signal would tell them that they were flying in the correct direction. They were staying on that continuous note. But the precise area to drop their bombs was something that had to be communicated differently. And to accomplish this, there were a series of 3 beams that would intersect with the first. The first was a warning that the bombers were approaching the drop zones. Then there would be a second beam that was 50 kilometers closer to the target, which served a critical purpose when it came to navigation. After crossing the second beam, the aircraft would fly at a constant speed with a stopwatch running. Now, the exact speed didn't matter because airspeed was often not really known. The airspeed values given in an airplane were at best rough approximations of airspeed, which could not really account for things like wind speed, and so they bore little resemblance to what an aircraft's actual ground speed was. But the beam system fixed this because there were precisely 15 kilometers between the second and third beams of the system, and then precisely 15 kilometers between the third beam and the target. This meant that all the plane needed to do was pick a speed on the airspeed indicator, start a stopwatch at the second beam, and then fly the exact same amount after the third beam, and then they would drop their bombs. There was still some margin of error in a system like this, if wind changed between beams or if the beams were slightly off, but it was still far more effective than trying to just determine location based on a speed that could not be trusted and then a bearing to target that could not be trusted because the speed could not be trusted.
Want to learn how you can make smarter decisions with your money? Well, I've got the podcast for you. I'm Sean Piles, and I host NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast. On our show, we help listeners like you make the most of your finances. I sit down with NerdWallet's team of nerds, personal finance experts in credit cards, banking, investing, and more. We answer your real-world money questions and break down the latest personal finance news. The nerds will give you the clarity you need by cutting through the clutter and misinformation in today's world of personal finance. We don't promote get-rich-quick schemes or hype unrealistic side hustles. Instead, we offer practical knowledge that you can apply in your everyday life. You'll learn about strategies to help you build your wealth, invest wisely, shop for financial products, and plan for major life events. And you'll walk away with the confidence you need to ensure that your money is always working as hard as you are. So turn to the nerds to answer your real-world money questions and get insights that can help you make the smartest financial decisions for your life. Listen to NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
The corporate world is like the ocean. It's alluring, but it's also full of deadly creatures that can shred you to pieces.
It becomes kind of like a Game of Thrones political arena where everyone's trying to murder you to get your job or your title.
As former corporate executives, we know firsthand that navigating corporate waters is not easy.
My family doesn't come from corporate backgrounds, so I didn't have any sort of guidance in that.
I wish people would be able to understand in this corporate world that talking about things that don't work or identifying problems does not mean you're a problem.
We'll dive deep into what happens behind fancy corporate doors or Zoom backgrounds or whatever.
Are they really performance improvement plans or just a legal tool to get rid of people?
I know a lot of people have been saved because of them.
We've created a show to help you navigate tricky corporate situations based on research and real-life experience.
I have really good advice. Don't go to a strip club with your team.
Listen to the Ambie Award-nominated podcast, Surfing Corporate.
With the Germans using this radio navigation system, and the results of their bombing raids making it clear that they were able to find targets even at night, how did the British learn about this system and eventually begin to work against it? This is an area where our knowledge today even what I've shared with you so far in this episode, is actually harmful to our understanding of how the information was discovered by the British at the time. One of the great challenges of understanding history is that we know much more about the overall situation than the people did at the time, and all the British knew at the beginning was that the Germans were finding their targets, and they did not really have much more information than that. Their primary source of additional information was delivered to them, though, in the form of German airmen that survived their aircraft being shot down or having mechanical problems over Britain. There were many survivors that were captured after landing in Britain, either gently or not so gently, and as soon as they were on the ground, a process would begin. When an aircraft crashed, the site was quickly brought under the control of the local police, both to keep any downed airmen near the aircraft, but also to protect the site until the military and those in intelligence arrived. The intelligence officers would then investigate the site for information. Of particular importance were things like codebooks, maps, and other documents. They would also speak to the airmen and make a judgment call on whether or not each of the airmen might have additional information. Officers, navigators, pilots, or others that were thought to be possible sources of information would not be sent directly to prisoner of war camps, but were instead taken to sites operated for the purpose of gaining additional intelligence. The German airmen knew that these type of actions would be taken, and so efforts would be made to destroy evidence and information before the British arrived. For example, in one case, a German radio operator was found in a British field ripping up every single page of his notebook and burying it in the dirt. Now, in that case, many of those pieces were actually dug up and then reassembled, but the German airmen did at least try to prevent their collection. It was also known that downed airmen would be questioned by the British, because of course they would be. Although it's worth pointing out that the British were not using forceful interrogation methods, it was really just questioning. One of the best ways to improve the effectiveness of this questioning was for British intelligence officers to bring together a lot of information, or as much information as possible, that was gained from a variety of different sources to make it seem like they knew a lot more about what the German situation was than they actually did. Or to quote Group Captain Samuel Felkin, the chief interrogator of the RAF, quote, "The most common method of inducing prisoners to talk was a display on the part of the interrogation of profound knowledge of all aspects of the German Air Force, even to the names, nicknames, and idiosyncrasies of officers and their crew in a prisoner's own unit." End quote. In the 2024 series Masters of the Air, there's actually a really good scene that depicts this kind of interaction, only of course from the other side, with a downed American airman meeting with a German intelligence officer, but his approach to the interrogation is the same. Basically, the idea is that you gather up all of these little tidbits from POW letters and radio intercepts, microphones in prisoner of war housing perhaps, and other interrogations, and you make it seem like you already know everything. And so what would be the harm of the airmen saying what they know? Nothing can possibly be new information, right, when the interrogator already knows so much. In their efforts to gather up this information, one of the phrases that Felkin and his team kept picking up on was X-Gerät, which translates to X-equipment. This started popping up as early as February 1940, so well before the focus of German bombers shifted to Britain. But there was no clear indication of what it was or what it meant, and it would take some number of months before the British were able to begin piecing it together. Microphones positioned in POW housing was another really important way that information was gathered. This allowed the British to use a system whereby they bluffed their way through the initial interrogation, as I just talked about, again making it seem like they knew a whole bunch more than they knew. Then of course the prisoners would lie to them, because of course the prisoners would lie to them. This was the expected game. Then, when the prisoners were taken back to their accommodations, their conversations with other prisoners would be recorded, and those recordings were a very lucrative source of information. They were particularly good for things like this X-equipment that they were talking about, because it very quickly became apparent that the equipment was almost ubiquitous in the German aircraft, and that information about it was well known. This made the prisoners more chatty about it and its impact. For example, one prisoner would be recorded saying that the X-equipment was so good that blind bombing was the future of German bombing efforts. These were the kinds of comments that would help the British intelligence officers slowly piece together what things were used for, and then use that information in future interrogations, kind of to slowly push the ball down the field. It was during these prisoner conversations that another word popped up in relation to this X equipment, and that was Knickebein, which translates to crooked leg. This was another important piece of the puzzle because it was the phrase that was used to refer to this system in other German communications. For example, in mid-June, one of the Enigma decrypts contained the word Knickebein because it was a message which contained information about the exact position of one of the radio towers used for this system. Unfortunately for the British efforts, there were limits to what they could gain from these methods. Most German airmen, while they knew that a system was being used to guide them to their targets, did not know much of anything about how specifically it worked. The real breakthrough would come when a prisoner, who would be designated A231, would make it clear that he planned to tell the British everything he knew because he was a German that held anti-war beliefs, and he hoped that he could bring the war to a swift conclusion. He would describe this crooked leg system as a radio system that used intersecting radio beams to guide the German bombers to the target through the use of a radio receiver on the bombers themselves. This was really the key breakthrough because the British, while they'd kind of been piecing this together, they knew some of the terminology, they knew what it was trying to do, they did not know that there was a specific piece of equipment on the planes that was being used for this purpose. And when they found it, it became very clear why it had been overlooked. Of course, every single German aircraft that was brought down over Britain was examined, and anything of value was noted and studied. However, this Knickebein system was not some fancy or interesting looking device that was on the aircraft. It wasn't something of note at all. It was instead just a common radio receiver. It, in essence, hid in plain sight by just being a boring, unexceptional piece of equipment that they didn't really think about looking at in more detail. Once there was an understanding of the basics of how the system worked, that it was based on radio waves and that there was not some kind of special receiver device, it was time to try and intercept the signal. To do this, an Avro Anson was used, which was one of those aircraft types that nobody talks about, but which would end up being quite important to the overall British war effort. It was originally designed as a 2-engine maritime patrol aircraft, but its range and speed meant that it was not very good at that job and was replaced at the very start of the war. However, while it was retired from that job, it would take on another life as a training aircraft and then as what I would call a utility aircraft, used for things like light transport and people moving. Eventually, over 10,000 Ansons would be built, and it would go on to another life as a light civilian transport after the war, being used by small charter aircraft companies for decades. So yeah, the Avro Anson, very underappreciated aircraft, and that was a bit of a side tangent. So anyway, back to our story. In this case, it was put to use in the air over the Midlands with the purpose of finding the German radio signals and verifying the information that had been gained from other sources. The pilots were told that they would be able to find transmissions that were similar to the Lorenz radio signals that had been in use before the war for airfield position broadcasts. On their second path over the predicted area of the beam, they found exactly what they were searching for. While flying south, they ran into an area where they received dots, and then around 400 meters of a continuous signal, and then dashes. With this information, the British now knew exactly what the Germans were doing, and they moved on to the next logical step: countermeasures. The system that was developed would be codenamed Aspirin, and it was so simple that it did not even require any kind of special device. Instead, a group of 28 old Army radio transmitters were placed around the country, and then they just tuned to the same frequency that the Germans were using and blasted out the dash signal in all directions. This helped to confuse the German bombers by simply making it more difficult to follow the correct path with so much kind of additional noise in the way. But it was not a perfect system. In some ways, rushing out the Aspirin system was a mistake, because as soon as it started broadcasting, the Germans knew what was happening, and as soon as pilots began to return with news of all these dash signals, the Germans would shift their tactics. The first of these steps would be taken in late September, when in the middle of a bombing raid, the Germans switched their guidance signals to a different radio frequency. The bombers then shifted their frequency at the same time, so they kept the signal, but the British kept broadcasting on the old frequency, making for another crystal clear and uninterrupted signal for the German bombers. It can be easy to criticize the British for rushing out Aspirin, and producing a system that was easily detected. The better system would have been to develop their own radio waves that pushed the Germans off target by matching the exact structure of the system, just in a slightly different direction. So they would end up dropping their bombs on fields or whatever else they wanted to. But that system would have taken time, and almost every night German bombers were overhead, causing the solution to be rushed, even though it was known that it was not perfect. While the Germans began to adjust to British countermeasure efforts by doing things like swapping frequencies, the longer-term solution was simply to build out a more complex and capable system. This would eventually be referred to primarily as that X-Gerät codename or X device, which was also what Knickebein was known as to the British before they knew what it actually was. This adds some additional confusion to the entire situation. But the important part is that the new system was really just a more advanced version of what was in use before. Instead of just a regular radio signal that a person listened to and interpreted, the new system involved a visual display, which made it easier to interpret and easier for the airmen to ensure the radio signal was legitimate and that it was also followed correctly. The new signal also used much shorter wavelengths, which made it a generally tighter and a more accurate beam, which was only possible due to the better ways of following it with the graphical interface and then some electronic guidance. These new devices, however, were not fitted on as many aircraft, and they were instead primarily used by the specialized KGR-100 Pathfinders unit. This squadron would fly ahead of the primary bombers and drop incendiary bombs on the target. Then all the following bomb raid had to do was go roughly in the correct direction and then drop their own bombs on the fires. This arrangement was not perfect, but the Germans also, much like the British had done, chose expediency over perfection because they did not want to wait for enough of the new visual devices to arrive to equip all of their aircraft. As with the rushed deployment of Aspirin, this created interesting vectors for countermeasures from the British. And these countermeasures were successful a few times, and they were very, very simple. The British would race around the countryside, setting fires near expected targets of the German bombers. The raid would be detected by radar. There were only so many targets that specific raid paths could sort of drop bombs on or were worth dropping bombs on, and so some fields would be set alight around the city with the hope that it would cause even a few of the bombers to drop their payloads in the wrong place. Sometimes countermeasures are technologically advanced, requiring special technical information and radio transmitters and other such equipment. Sometimes all it takes is somebody with a match and a bit of grass. War is weird like that. All of these countermeasures and all of this effort was being put in place to try and impact the efficacy of German bombing raids during 1940. Next episode, we will switch our focus to the state of British strategic bombing efforts during the summer of 1940. The best summary I can give is that they were trying. They were really trying. But they were struggling against the fact that some of the core assumptions that had driven British strategic bombing theory during the 1930s were proving to be ineffective and complete, and sometimes actively harmful to staging a successful bombing campaign.